It is ironic that I should be speaking about silence today. Communicating with one another is essential to our lives as human beings. From childhood, we learn to name objects, places, and things and follow or mimic the voice of others in our lives. Our personalities as a physical person is strong instead of our innate, permanent nature as spiritual beings. Talking makes us express our feelings, thoughts in phrases like I'm doing right now. But how was this sense of self before we learned to think with our brain with words? The voice of the silence says, the pupil must regain the child state he has lost ere the first sound can fall upon his ear. Fragment 1. To quieten the mind, less words or no words is essential. The vow of silence is a religious vow. It is taken in a monastic context to remain silent. The word for silence is mauna in Sanskrit and maunam in my language, Tamil. In fact, a muni is a saint or seer who practices silence. The practice is prevalent in Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism in India and the East, but the tradition is familiar in the Christian faith as well. It is followed as a spiritual discipline. The vow of silence is given a prominent place, even though interpersonal interaction is encouraged for togetherness and growth. The vow is to condition the mouth to speak rightly, following the eightfold path. One of them is right speech, not to say harmful words. This kind of silence is what prevents one from hurting others and oneself. Furthermore, as in regular social situations, silence helps us to listen to others. Good listening leads to humility. Most important, it quietens the mind, which is a difficult thing to do. At the very outset of the voice of the silence, it is stated, the mind is the great slayer of the real. Let the disciple slay the slayer. Silence also avoids actions that will attract samsara, the circle of life, death, and rebirth. Finally, self-awareness and self-love through the practice of silence leads to compassion and universal love for all. Benedictine monks follow Saint Benedict's rules of obedience, stability, and fidelity to the monastic way of life. They practice periods of silence as well. Obedience meant to listen intently to the voice of God. Stability binds the monk in both body and spirit to the community of his profession all his life. And fidelity includes poverty and chastity and renunciation of all worldly possessions. Students in ancient India lived in the teacher or guru's house and did the chores of the household there. The pupil gained the name of Shravaka or listener. In ancient Greece, he was named Acoustikos. He was not even permitted to ask questions. Seed thoughts or Bija Sutras were given to him to ponder about. These thoughts were intended to purify the chela or pupil and convert, in the words of B.P. Wadia, passion into compassion, lust into love, and antipathy into sympathy. Now he was ready to become a shramana or exerciser, the asketos of Greece. In the Cana Upanishad, now Upanishad is part of the Vedas, whereas the Vedas, which are the ancient Hindu scriptures, talk about the rules and regulations of life mostly. The Upanishads talk about the philosophy. So in the Cana Upanishad, the student asks the teacher many questions about the invisible one. And one question is, who causes my tongue to speak? The teacher responds, that which makes the tongue speak, but cannot be spoken by the tongue. Know that as the self. This self is not someone other than you. Pythagoras, the Greek philosopher and mathematician, who was influenced by the Hindu scriptures, imposed a strict regimen of silence among his disciples. He established a school in a city in ancient Greece. He wished to make that polis, city, a city of souls in search of wisdom in harmony with all mankind. He had very strict rules for admission, a period of 5 years when new students maintained total silence. The silence was supposed to be leading to self-examination and self-respect. This self-respect was very different from the interpretation given by psychoanalysis and psychiatrists, because those kinds of self-respect only feeds the personality. Now, mere silence could be a form of passive-aggressive behavior, full of resentment and anger. So many times, it is better to remain silent than mention things that could lead to confusion, hurt, and anger in others. However, the confusion, anger, and hurt, etc., needs to be eradicated if we need to be working towards spiritual silence. B.P. Wadia was from the Bombay ULT Lodge and was an ardent student of theosophy. He published the Theosophical Movement magazine for several years. He was, according to my father, the embodiment of a student who appeared as nothing in the eyes of men. His book, Living the Life, has an article entitled The Vow of Silence. He begins the article by talking about the dangers of gossip and says that this kind of small talk is injurious speech and hurts other people's character and corrupts our own. Spiritual life demands the value of silence, and he talks about the connection between what we put as food into our mouths and what comes out as words. Then he compares our psychic nature's way of assimilation and elimination and says, one of the ways of elimination is the power of speech. People who have gone through trauma sometimes do not wish, cannot, or don't want to speak. This is not a vow of silence of a monastic order. This is the result of severe pain, sorrow, shock, and requires therapeutic ways to heal. Then there are those who decide not to speak as a form of protest. John Francis, an environmentalist who lived in the West Coast, took a vow of silence after witnessing the San Francisco oil-based spill in 1971. And he didn't speak for almost 17 years. Though all these forms of silence are a legitimate part of our lives in the world we live and need to be acknowledged, the focus today will be on the significance of silence from a theosophical point of view. The Light on the Path, page 12 says, speech comes only with knowledge. Attain to knowledge and you will attain to speech. This is explained on page 25 of The Light on the Path. It is impossible to help others till you have obtained some certainty of your own. When you have learned the first 21 rules and have entered the hall of learning with your powers developed and sense unchained, then you will find within you there is a fount from which speech will arise. And if we are familiar with what is said in those 21 rules before the notes, we understand that it is all about eliminating and transforming our kama manas. Even before the rules, we are told to treat our eyes, ears, voice, and soul with reverence. When one is not ready, there will be mistakes. Hence, getting rid of what holds us down, selfishness, envy, lust, running after power, wealth, paves the way to practicing silence. All our devotional books talks about this. The Voice of the Silence spends 2 parts talking about the dangers, telling us what not to do. And then in the final section, talks about a proactive way of cultivating the 7 paramitas. But it is important to ponder on the very first page, where it states, he who would hear the voice of nada, the soundless sound, and comprehend it, he has to learn the nature of dharana. What is nada? The footnote in the Voice of the Silence says, the soundless sound, or the voice of the silence. Literally, this would read, the voice in the spiritual sound, as nada is the equivalent word in Sanskrit for the Zenza term. Shankaracharya, the great exponent of Vedanta Advaita, talks about this soundless sound in one of the Dakshinamurti slokas or stotrams, as they are called. Dakshinamurti is the name of Shiva, expounding the sacred and secret Brahma Vidya, sitting facing southwards. Dakshina in Sanskrit. Shankaracharya says, Chitram Vadataror Mule Vridya Shishya Gurur Yuva Gurostu Mauna Vyakyanam Shishyastu Chinna Samshaya. Translated, it is indeed a strange picture to behold. At the root of a banyan tree are seated aged disciples in front of a young teacher. The teaching is silence. All doubts are removed from the minds of the disciples. This shloka is etched in my mind since I heard it from childhood. I was fascinated by the concept of learning without words, being in school at the time and hearing words constantly. However, many years later, coupling this verse with the early words in the Voice of the Silence, the sound of silence is powerful and requires preparation to get to the point of making sense of silence. Dharana is intense concentration, and before you reach that stage, the student has already rid himself of the impediments that clutter his mind. Let us look at something quite different to understand a little more about silence. In my working days, many years ago, I was once a director of a public school program, having regular meetings with the staff. I noticed an undercurrent of hostility and unwillingness to work with me. For some time, I felt there was probably something wrong with my interactions. And a close friend recommended attending Tavistock workshops with the Rice Institute. The A.K. Rice Institute for the Study of Social Systems looks at how unconscious thoughts and feelings significantly affect our lives in group situations whether at home, workplace, or at a national level. Hoping to modify my behavior, I went eagerly for the 3-day workshop. There was no agenda, and we were given a little information about the institute and formed small groups with a facilitator, and then joined everybody else in the large group. These alternating groups happened for the first 2 days. The most fascinating and probably scary fact was that there was no topic to talk about. And in each meeting, the facilitators sat silently. The only thing they told us is not to have any cerebral conversations. There was silence initially, and all of a sudden, someone would break the silence to say something, because most people do not like to keep quiet. With time, this would lead to annoyance at the point of this kind of a workshop. But with time, hidden feelings of biases would come bubbling to the surface. By the second day, there were people spitting out a lot of vitriol that was quite shocking and painful to hear. Occasionally, some good feelings would also come out. At the end of it all, I understood that biases in group situations might act as an impediment to working together. However, as a student of theosophy, I had to look deeper and discover my own biases and blocks in going beyond the personality. The empty agenda, the silence of a workshop, should not lead to lower manasic or psychic vibrations against other people's inner thoughts and wishes when they come pouring out. It also leads to something the Light on the Path talks about on page 24, about footnote 8. Intelligence is impartial. No man is your enemy. No man is your friend. All alike are your teachers. Your enemy becomes a mystery that must be solved. Your friend becomes a part of yourself, an extension of yourself, a riddle hard to read. Only one thing is more difficult to know: your own heart. Not until the bonds of personality are loosened can that profound mystery of self begin to be seen. So going back to the Dakshinamurti sloka, the aged disciples have already done the work of crushing the bud of personality and elevating themselves to really hear what the young guru or teacher is saying, even in his silence. It is the silence of meditation, knowing the nature of dharana and hearing the soundless sound. Silence does not mean emptiness. When we sleep, even though we are silent, there is a lot of activity going on. The organs in our body are still carrying on their functions. The blood is circulating and the heart is still beating. Furthermore, as stated by H.P. Blavatsky in the Transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge, page 60, for our ego lives in its own separate life within its prison of clay whenever it becomes free from the trammels of matter, that is, during the sleep of the physical body. Perhaps one should say that death is silence. Once again, the decomposition and the dissolution of the physical, astral, and karmic principles take times. And there are a lot of things that are happening during this process. Silence does not mean no movement. Think of the germination process of a seed placed in soil. For a few days, there seems to be no change, but then suddenly the worm-like appearance of germination is seen, which is always a miracle to behold. An understated seed burgeons with life when soil and water conditions are right. So whether it is pralaya, death, sleep, the apparent inaction and silence is illusory. All this just goes to show that words are not always needed to explain, pontificate, elaborate, clarify. When the pupil is ready, the master communicates. And the communication does not have to be in the words we on this plane can comprehend. Perhaps it is speech on a different plane. This brings us to the question of what speech is. The glossary says to call Vak speech is deficient in clearness. Vak is the mystic personification of speech and the female logos. In one sense, Vak is speech by which knowledge is taught to man. In another, she is the mystic, secret speech, which descends upon and enters into the primeval rishis, as the tongues of fires are said to have sat upon the apostles. In The Sacred Doctrine, Volume 1, page 432, H.P. Blavatsky, quoting Subbarao from his book, Notes on the Bhagavad Gita, elaborates on this. Our old writers said that Vak is of four kinds: Para, Pashyanti, Madhyama, and Vaikari, a statement found in the Rig Veda and Upanishads. Vaikari Vak is what we utter. It is sound, speech, that again becomes comprehensive and objective to one of the physical planes, senses, and may be brought under the laws of perception. Hence, every kind of Vaikari Vak exists in its Madhyama, Pashyanti, and ultimately in its Para form. The reason why Pranava is called Vak is this, that these four principles of the great cosmos correspond to these four forms of Vak. The whole cosmos in its objective form is Vaikari Vak. The light of the Logos is the Madhyama form, and the Logos itself, the Pashyanti form, while Parabrahma is the Para, beyond the noumenon of all noumena aspect of that Vak. Again, the Dakshinamurti sloka gets new meaning. Silence is a different kind of speech, and the old students sitting under the banyan tree understand the meaning and significance of silence. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras is trying to instruct us about the true meaning of meditation and silence and concentration, reaching the various levels of meditation and the nature of dharana. The vow of silence and the significance of spiritual silence is an ongoing study for all students of theosophy. I shall end with two quotations. The first is a story from Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, which I shall call Partial Silence or the Vow of Silence. It's titled, Is That So? The Zen master Hakuin was praised by his neighbors as one living a pure life. A beautiful Japanese girl whose parents owned a food store lived near him. Suddenly, without any warning, her parents discovered that she was with child. This made her parents angry. She would not confess who the man was, but after much harassment, at last named Hakuin. In great anger, the parents went to the master. Is that so? Was all he would say. After the child was born, it was brought to Hakuin. By this time, he had lost his reputation, which did not trouble him, but he took very good care of the child. He obtained milk from his neighbors and everything else the little one needed. A year later, the girl mother could stand it no longer. She told her parents the truth, that the real father of the child was a young man who worked in the fish market. The mother and father of the girl at once went to Hakuin to ask his forgiveness, to apologize at length, and to get the child back again. Hakuin was willing. In yielding the child, all he said was, "Is that so?" The second is from B.P. Wadia's article called The Vow of Silence. B.P. Wadia talks here about 7 ways in which we need to be conducting the vow of silence. He says, a vow of silence does not mean to become mute and not to speak at all. It consists in 1, self-imposition of periodic silence. 2, not indulging at any time in injurious and untruthful speech. 3, not giving ways to useless speech. 4, not asking questions on philosophy or practice till what has already been taught or is before us is fully scanned and thoroughly looked into from the point of view of our particular questions. 5, not indulging in ahankaric speech, that is, not making statements about the divine self or ego in terms of our karmic or lower nature. 6, not indulging in injurious speech regarding our lower nature, our own faults and weaknesses, lest by speaking of them, we lend them the strength which ensues from the power of speech. And 7, not to speak even that which is true, unless at proper times, to proper people, under proper circumstances. B.P. Wadia says this should be done in secrecy and not talked about. He ends his article with, there are 100 who plunge into the waters of the ocean for pleasure or profit, to only one who dives for the pearl of great price. The latter proceeds to his work in the secrecy of silence, and his art in the ocean is of a very different kind from that of the ordinary swimmer. Those who are in search for the pearl of wisdom must acquire the strength of muscle, the control of breath, and the finesse of stroke necessary against the stormy billows of this ocean of samsara. These lie securely hidden in the power of silence. That power must be invoked not by a pledge to some other being, but by a vow silently sung and silently registered in the sanctuary of the heart. Thus, the path begins in silence and secrecy and ends in the hearing and the chanting of the soundless sound. Thank you.
Thank you, Shobha.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you.
Wow.
That's like sculpting, Shobha. It's like a wonderful sculpture of the great Greek sculptor Phidias. To listen to it is to be elevated.
Thank you. Thank you. Many of the words are from the great ones, so I'm just repeating a lot of words from them.
would you be so kind as to take some questions from
Sure.
the audience?
Sure.
Anybody feel free to either raise their hand, or maybe in the very beginning, people could just start volunteering questions. But once things get going, perhaps raise your hand on that feature, raise hand feature.
I do have a question.
Okay.
When we think about a person has a genuine desire to understand something in the philosophy,
Mhm.
and so they put their mind and attention on a wonderful, rich idea, and so they contemplate it for a while, but then they become silent, mentally silent.
Mhm.
Is the silence also necessary for germination, for assimilation, so that it becomes as important as thought about?
I think we underestimate the importance of silence, because, even in social situations, it's so important that we listen to what another person is saying. And it allows us not to always hear our own voice, which I keep doing right now. But it's important, I think, for the silence, for meditation. Actually, one of the most important things is silence before you can even begin to meditate. So I think this is why we need to be talking more. I know this is so ironic to say this, but we need to be talking more about silence, because it's just remarkable that Pythagoras talked about it. And I have another interesting quotation that I discovered in the Isis Unveiled in volume 1, page 248, where H.P. Blavatsky talks about this phrase, dig not the fire with a sword. And she says, Pythagoras, every sentence of Pythagoras, like most of this ancient maxim, has a dual significance. While it has an occult physical meaning expressed literally in the words, it embodied a moral precept. So Iamblichus, explaining this about Pythagoras in the life of Pythagoras, says, it is difficult to fight with anger, for whatever is necessary to be done redeems the soul. And for many, by gratifying anger, have changed the condition of their soul and have made death preferable to life. But by governing the tongue and being quiet, friendship is produced from strife, the fire of anger being extinguished, and you yourself will not appear to be destitute of intellect. So, dig not fire with a sword has a dual meaning, a literal meaning, and a meaning that implies that keep quiet instead of provoking anger. And I found that remarkable, that H.P. Blavatsky here, quoting from Iamblichus's book, talks about the power of silence. So I find, I remember somebody saying, it is better to lose an argument than lose a friend. Better to be silent than lose the argument, than lose a friend. I find that it is so hard for us to do because we always want to prove a point.
Can you take unless Jim, do you have a follow through? There's a few hands raised here.
I'll wait. I have something else, but I'll wait. No problem.
Okay. Thank you for that. Richard?
Okay. First, I want to say thank you very much for this message. It's such enlightening and a blessing to me. And I have to say that the universe is at work, because the timing of this message fell into my life right at the proper time. I wanted to make the comment, like I'm a ham radio operator, and when dealing with Morse code, the silence is equally as important as the sound, because without the silence, we could not interpret the dit dit dot dot dit dit dit. Is that silence that distinguished uh, uh, the the dashes and the beats. So it's like the contrast. We have to have contrast. Everything in life is contrast. It's a duality. So without the silence, uh, we would have no comprehension of a spoken word. So I totally understand, and I appreciate the message, because it has the power to make me a better listener. And I want to thank you for the message this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I love that analogy. That's a beautiful analogy. A good teacher listens before she or he gives the answer to the student. And that's a very difficult thing sometimes for teachers to do. Wait for the student to answer. Wait for the silence and let the student take time to answer. So I think silence is so important in our lives in so many ways, not just in the spiritual sense, but even in daily, day-to-day life. And believe me, as I can tell you, yours truly has a very difficult time with silence.
Thank you. Robert?
Yes, it's very hard to keep speech silent if you can't have a silent mind. But I wonder if you have any thoughts about the difference between a silent mind and a passive mind.
Mm.
Good question.
Very good. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. A silent mind is not cluttered, right? It is ready to accept, ready to learn, ready to meditate. A passive mind is not active. A silent mind can be active, right? It's not, a silence doesn't mean passivity. I wish I had added passivity to that. And if we look at the 10 propositions of in the Isis Unveiled, the medium is a passive being, right? The adept is an active being. So passivity is not good. Maybe there are situations where passivity might be good, but it's not silence. It's just not being in control, right? Passivity is not being in control.
Are there any other questions or comments?
Laura, you have to unmute. Okay.
Yes. I wonder if there is an energy of will or force that is lost when we speak too much. When we, if that we lose an energy of a certain kind, especially when we are wanting to do a certain project or to set about a certain kind of work. Is there energy lost in talking about things?
Most definitely. I think B.P. Wadia's 7 rules, 7 points are enlightening, because he says not giving way to useless speech, right? We do a lot of that, right? Shop talk that we call, right? And so this is something my father said about B.P. Wadia, and I think he considered B.P. Wadia to be one of his mentors. And he would say he was not given to flowery speeches and talking a lot. He always took a back seat. He was very quiet. But when he did speak, he was crystal clear and distilled. So I think some people, when they speak, it's like the Dalai Lama. You can listen to him all the time because he has so much to say in his succinct style, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
we can see that in B.P. Wadia's writings,
right,
that there is so much condensed into one sentence.
right.
There is an economy of sound and language in his writing,
Right.
which is truly remarkable. We struggle so much to try and get an idea out that we use too many words. And so maybe that's an indication that we need to be silent more.
Right. Thank you, Laura. Yeah.
Jim, do you want to circle back around?
Oh, I was just thinking something from once many years ago. I had the good fortune of looking back at ancient Indian education, and then I took that and when I heard about Pythagoras and his 5 years of silence, I could see perhaps a parallel, because it seemed that the point of it, one of the points of why it was a discipline, was because it's important with children initially, and with adults certainly, that you emphasize the ear, not the tongue. And furthermore, that so you learn to listen, you learn to pay attention to elders, you learn to assimilate, because children assimilate out of love more, or in respect, more than they do by rational analysis.
Mhm.
That comes later.
Mhm.
But with an adult too, one of the interesting things that I learned was that one of the reasons the adults had to be quiet is because so much of what we say is ego-centered. And part of being in the Pythagorean school is you had to learn to really love truth.
Mhm.
Therefore, if your questions and your comments were ultimately ego projections, or trying to get attention, or trying to get praise, or any of these subtle things that happen, it really subtracts from your spiritual understanding. And furthermore, one of the things I really found interesting is when you're not allowed to speak and you have questions, you begin to burn for answers,
Mhm.
but you're not allowed to say anything. So then you're hoping that some of your colleagues who are allowed to speak will raise the question that you want to have answered. And
Right.
so it becomes so genuine because you really want to ask this question, and now you've sifted it down. You could, where it's a genuine question. It's not ego at all. It's really wanting to know, wanting to learn, and you have some humility. And when your friend or someone asks the question, you're so thrilled. And so you've forgotten yourself in the very act of trying to seek an answer to a question. So anyway, I found that just really kind of fascinating. And I think it says, it kind of dovetails with what you were saying.
Yeah. Even in Theosophy, we are told so often. I remember I started Theosophy probably from the age of 6 or 7. We would just sit there, and those days it was boring for us, to be perfectly honest. We were little kids, but we just sat there. And I remember hearing the speaker say something like, questions, and then remember, you need to think before you ask your question. So it's like the little kid that I was would be like, oh, I don't know if I can ask this question, but it also made you think as you grew older that you need to do the work. You need to be doing the work before you ask a question. Because, like I've heard it said, when somebody flippantly asks, okay, so what is Theosophy? People would say, you can't talk about Theosophy when you're waiting for the bus or trying to, It's not something that can be said in a few words, right? And so the question about, so what is all this theosophy stuff that you are into? People ask you, So it's like, I usually have to say, do you have about an hour to listen? So I think the question has to be genuine, and the question has to be thought out before you even articulate it.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions? And Anthony.
Anthony, you're muted. You're muted, Anthony.
Can theosophy be described with silence?
Well, that's the whole Dakshinamurti sloka for you, right?
Yeah.
That's the whole, it's amazing how Shankaracharya captures so much in that. To me at that young age, it was like somebody telling me that the star you see in the heavens, by the time the light reaches your eye, that star is gone. That was mind-boggling at that age, and it's mind-boggling at this age. So this whole thing about silence and all doubts are cleared was mind-boggling then, and it still is. Because even though I could interpret it in many different ways, I think theosophy in many ways, the amazing thing is H.P. Blavatsky has written these tomes of books, right? I mean, the Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine, to go through that is itself a peregrination for us, right? I mean, it's a long journey, even to finish them and understand them, which is more than a lifetime. So yet, it still doesn't help us. And Anthony, you're right. I think we need to look for the voice in the silence. And that's the whole thing about the voice of the silence, right? The soundless sound. The spaces, the white noise, or like the gentleman said about Morse code, the silence in between, right?
Yeah.
Shobha, I heard a very, very, very fascinating comment on another class on the Bhagavad Gita. The Swami was saying to train, a very, very easy way to train your mind to be silent within doing a mantra is that in between each repetition of the mantra, you maintain a few beats of silence. Instead of just saying Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya, you would say Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya. And he said you wouldn't believe how easy it is to facilitate this. You would think it would be so difficult, but somehow our minds will actually take to that silence. I just thought I'd comment on that. Thank you, Shobha, for that wonderful, wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Shobha, it seemed like just a comment on that a lot of times speech or sound is a way into silence, that you couldn't hear the silence if you hadn't heard the sound. But I have a question again, if you don't mind.
Wow.
I'm very grateful indeed, like everyone else. So I've always been intrigued about these three monkeys that say, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil.
Right,
But,
right.
But it, we see evil. We hear So, and we can kind of get to the point like, okay, I don't want to speak any evil, but is that not possible if one's seeing and hearing evil?
You know, it's funny you should bring this up. I'm reading a book somebody gave me, written by a Toltec from Mexico. It's called a Toltec. He's an indigenous group, Toltec. The Toltecs were
Toltec. Yes.
yeah,
Okay.
Toltecs, yeah. Toltecas, they say Toltecas.
Yeah.
And he talks about the fact about how we interpret things. The book is called The Four Agreements, and it's by Don Miguel Ruiz. And basically he says, we hear what people say and we get hurt. We take it as evil. But he says that everybody is in their own zone. So it's not about you. They're not hurting you. They're not. So I find this very interesting, how you look at evil, and how do you, and this was Gandhi's thing. Gandhi was the one who brought this, use that hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. But I think it's more a question of how B.P. Wadia talks about what you take in and what you bring out, what you eat and what you bring out. He talks about the internal and the elimination. It comes out as words. So he says it has to be extremely careful how we interpret these things. So yes, there is evil if you want to see evil, but you can also say that there is love everywhere, right? It's how you look at it, right? Even if there's somebody you think is evil, an embodiment of evil, there's probably something about that person that's good, but we only see the evil, right? So I think that was the point of those three monkeys, the hear no evil, see no evil, and speak no evil. I think it goes back to what the Light on the Path talks about, with the eyes must be incapable of tears, the ears must have lost their sensitiveness, and the voice cannot speak, without, not to be, sensitive, and the voice cannot speak, and all of them. The first two are negative and the second two are positive when she talks about it in the notes. But I think it's all connected. How are we viewing the world? How do we look at the world? And I'm not saying we need to be naive and say that there's everything is fine and dandy, but recognize that we are a part of it too, right? We are all one. So if there is evil out there, there is evil in us too, right? I mean, that's a hard thing, to find out who we are. Our friends can tell us, our enemies tell it more often, but are we willing to listen, right? So.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Just as a kind of footnote, Shobha, in a sense of hearing no evil, I think it continually distills itself to the exercise of discretion, in the sense that you can hear evil, you can hear gossip, but you don't have to respond to it or further it. In fact, you can distract it and convert it and change its direction.
Right.
You can see it, but you don't have to give it great value. And as you were saying, you can make it an effort to look for what is good in the situation or relationship and try to make your mind focus on that rather than the other. And so I think it is, like you say, it is something dynamic, but it is not the Pollyannish, or it's not the Christian Science and pretending it doesn't exist.
Right.
That's it's like Gandhi once said about suffering. It might well be that the world is an illusion, but to those in great deprivation and suffering, it's very real.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
so-
Yeah, there was a student of theosophy from London who came to the Delhi Lodge, Ethel Beswick, and she said something at one of the meetings. You don't put yourself in that situation, which is similar to what you just said, Jim. If somebody says something, gossip or whatever, don't respond to it, don't add to it, right?
Yeah, and try to move the situation. It's what B.P. Wadia talking about, converting evil to good.
Right.
That's every situation presents an opportunity to the person who's vigilant and very aware and very much concerned with always sifting to what seems to be promising or possible. But as you say, sometimes you can just say nothing. There's nothing you can do or say. You have to endure it as part of the karmic situation in which you can perhaps in the future make a better contribution.
Right.
Toba, I had a question. A while back, actually, speaking of, I think Bombay, India, ULT, the magazine called the Theosophical Movement, I think it's still happening. And
yes, it's still happening.
And there's some remarkable articles that really come out in that. And maybe five-ish years ago, can't remember the name of it, but there was an article talking about, I think it's called Thoughts on Theosophical Meetings. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right. And
incredible.
Yeah. And it was talking about kind of the preparation for meetings and so forth. I think some of this, I guess, applies to Zoom meetings, right? And hopefully it'll apply to one day when we can actually have meetings. But there's this incredible thing that happens in this article, the way they kind of set it up, is many people, even though they're not on the platform, they can bring quite a bit to the meeting, even if they don't even say anything. That we'll just leave it at that, because anything else I said would kind of diminish from it. And maybe I'll find that article and repost it on the San Diego website or something.
Thank you.
But my question has to do with the formulating of questions. Sometimes by asking a question or stumbling through asking a question, like I'm doing now, helps us formulate what the question is. But with the B.P. Wadia idea, there's more assimilation and preparation and silence that really could be put into the question. I was wondering if you could kind of compare those two approaches.
Yeah, I think if a question is genuine, you can stumble through it. It doesn't matter, right? And I think the person who is trying to answer, again, here's something, in theosophy, it's not like we know everything. And least of all, I'm very aware of how little I know. But we try to help each other when we ask questions and respond, right? So it's not like one person knows everything, so it's a very different way of interacting in theosophy. And so there is that. But there's merit in both ways, right? Doing your preparation before you ask a question. What is amazing to me sometimes is I think I'm asking a stupid question, and somebody out there will say, "That was amazing." In the theosophy class, it's like, really? And that kind of encourages you to think more deeply about it, which often happens in theosophy classes, where because sometimes you say something without even having pondered it, but maybe the intuition is playing a role there, right? And it aids you in saying something. We are right from the outset told not to. You can tell if a question is flippant or is genuine, right? If you've been in around the students of Theosophy. You learn by osmosis. You learn from each other. And so I think there's a merit in both ways. That's what I think. So somebody else may have a different opinion or way of looking at it, different way of looking at it.
Well, just one thought to throw in to that, because it's so relevant. Part of the discussion is that often one finds oneself raising a question that may not be something that's perplexing to oneself, but that one is thinking on behalf perhaps of newer students that may be in the hall or may be listening, and wanting to draw out, related themes that might help clarify, that hadn't yet been mentioned by the presenter, and just to fill in some of the detail that may be helpful to someone who's newer to Theosophy. So to me, that seems like a very relevant approach, that you're attempting to ask, not just for oneself, but on behalf of those present.
Absolutely. I think we sometimes do that, right? I think it's, you feel the vibes, right? You feel the vibrations, and either due to shyness or well, mostly it's a question of not being feeling like, oh my God, can I even ask this question? Sometimes as a new student or a young student. But the amazing thing is, as we've seen in the Sunday San Diego classes, everybody who comes up there and talks, I mean, they may have just entered classes. There's the work and the preparation and the presentations are always amazing, because people who come and stay in Theosophy want to work, right? Want to work for it. So, but yes, I think that's wonderful that's why I don't just say questions. It's comments, suggestions, anything, right? It doesn't have to be a question. It can be a comment, suggestion. You learn from each other, right?